Hello, in this video, I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about racial capitalism and intellectual property protections and talk a little bit about racial capitalism as an affirmative strategy. I actually think that out of like all of the critical literature bases, racial capitalism is one of the better ones for a resolution like this, because I think that a lot of the ways that people have talked about responding to racial capitalism, especially at a global scale, has been a lot of like really heated debate about like what types of international models for like activism and resistance people can take up instead of like using governmental models or using the sovereign. And I feel like the WTO is such a big global organization that there are so many interesting arguments to be made about like what are the underside of these organizations, or how people organize in the face of them and find connections through them is a really interesting place for you to kind of like draw a lot of like critical ideas for this as an affirmative as a whole, and that I think can end up being like really strategic. And so I kind of want to talk about what I think are some like the best versions of what this affirmative looks like and what I think some of those better methods are, but also talk a little bit about what I think in terms of maybe what some of their weaknesses are and how they'll deal with some of the challenges from like other criticism and stuff like that, which I definitely think can be something really challenging. I think that like for instance, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about from the intro to intellectual property protections and racial capitalism video was a lot about like why I thought that as like an affirmative field this could be really interesting, just because of the way that the different portions of the resolution already kind of like lend themselves to being very potent under a critique of racial capitalism. But I also think there are a lot of like methodological responses that the criticism gives that can be really good for an affirmative, and so I kind of want to start there. When I'm thinking about like what are some of like the best ways to write this affirmative, or my best tips for writing the affirmative as a whole, the things that I'm really thinking about are how can you take the things like that have been spoken through in terms of historical lectures that have been given for people like the Black Panther Party when they were exploring things like intercommunalism, or thinking about the various types of ways in which like international anarchism, international communism, etc. has become something that is actually trended, or become something that's become really popular amongst activists in terms of what type of frame that we use internationally. And then I feel like once you kind of have an epistemological frame for how people find connections on the international scale, a lot of the other problems that people tend to bring up with a lot of affirmatives, in my opinion, really fall through, because I feel like a lot of the consequences or a lot of the like impacts that people want to weigh against these types of affirmatives are ones that are specifically about why you cannot like address these kind of concerns of like intellectual property, medicine, etc., and the ability of like knowledge to be commodified in order to like be able to distribute bare resources. But I actually feel like the question of like intercommunalism, the question of like sabotaging institutions like the WTO and others that attempt to like be those sovereign institutions that kind of like figure and make these things possible, as like really interesting points of like criticism for how things like intercommunalism, i.e. the way in which we're able to find connections and commonality between like marginalized and dispossessed people through anti-capitalism internationally, can be really interesting ways to like think about not only organizational processes, but also be a way for you to have like a really strong historically grounded argument that is able to really cite across history various types of examples where people have been able to use these international connections in order to create conferences, modes of resistance, ways of creating material kind of like ways stances that stretch from like various types of countries, even from like the 1960s to now, which I think allows you to have like a really strong like breadth of like arguments that you can really make, especially when you're thinking about how practices like intercommunalism relate to like questions of how like Black Lives Matter and other types of organizations are relating to the question of like Palestine and things like that internationally, all kind of show that there's like always this kind of like underlying question of the relationship between marginalized populations across various like disparate countries and stuff like that. And I definitely think that being able to use the affirmative as a way to bring those things together can be a way to resolve a lot of the offense that I think people generally want to read against these types of arguments in terms of their ability to scale. And then I think it just becomes a question of how do you kind of like engage the materiality debate at a level where you're not feeling like you're fighting against the weight of the international system, but feel like you're kind of like taking up this underside in order to like host this series of tactics that kind of like sabotage the institutions that maintain various forms of like racial capitalism and dispossession, etc., which is where I think this affirmative like finds a lot of strength. I feel like a lot of the case arguments that are usually read against like arguments like intercommunalism are ones that kind of like go down that same path of being like this really like strong international like more horizontal leaning type of like movement making process for how we kind of like think about socialism and communism. Definitely tends to be like a place where I feel like a lot of the case arguments are like, violent revolutions can't solve, that intercommunalism doesn't scale up, that it fails at a historical level because of, previous like failures between like the Black Panther Party and like Mao in China and stuff like that. And so I think there are a lot of really interesting arguments to be made about like what type of like examples you can tap into to counter stuff like that. And I definitely think there are actually like a lot of really good ones in order for you to reach for that. I don't think that like we have the time to do like a full history lesson on now, but I think they're really interesting because like even if you think about the relation between like Mao and the Black Panther Party and the way that that's changed between like how marginalized communities in America like think about things like Palestine, think about things like the Uyghurs, etc., all are really good examples of like how the various forms like racialization and sovereignty take under the same processes regardless of kind of like where you are in the world, and that those kind of like foundational institutional practices are kind of like the necessary like things that need to be refused in order to like make these types of methods and make a different type of redistribution of such bare necessities like possible. And I think that when people are kind of like asking you what this means in terms of like intellectual property protections as a field, I feel like most critical responses will be towards like the question of just abolishing the field as a whole, because of the way in which the ownership and commodity over like or the usage of knowledge as a commodity tends to be weaponized against various like populations of culture of color, because of the way in which like ideas about like the Western scientists, etc., are like used to monopolize and make ideas about like who is like doing science, who holds knowledge, like who is able to save the world, etc., which are all kind of like valuable questions to really ask in terms of like how we think about intellectual property protections beyond just like the literal laws themselves. I think then in terms of things like your framework and T arguments, a lot of the stuff that you want to do for framework and T has to do with the ability of you to be able to win that the type of like sovereign approach to how we respond to intellectual property protections necessarily requires like not only a coercive approach that comes from the WTO, like in the last couple of videos that we were talking about, but also means that countries are having to put like more on the line than just like the individual modes of resistance, that the attempt to like represent yourself in the name of the sovereign ultimately forces you to answer questions of how you can maintain the health of the entire populace, which ultimately changes the way in which we're able to think about calculations for what types of chances that we want to take and what types of resistances are like most valuable and like meaningful. And so I definitely think that like making those as like core limitations on how the functionality of something like the WTO kind of constricts itself to like the way in which things like international corporations and larger like countries or international standing are able to assert themselves and like change the kind of terms of these like policies, etc., all I think can be really interesting ways for you to kind of like really get at the gut question of what I think a lot of like topicality or like framework kind of looking responses to these affirmatives will look like, and definitely will be kind of also how you kind of frame the material concerns that you'll take into some other debates that you'll be having on against like criticism, counterplans, and disads in the next video that I'll be doing. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully you'll be able to use it for how you kind of write your own affirmative for racial capitalism on the intellectual property protections topic. And yeah, hopefully you'll keep tuning in for more. Thanks.